It's the week ending Saturday, the 19th of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen America grappling with extremism in Charlottesville, the government releasing position papers on the Irish border post-Brexit, and, well, there's been far too much talk about a large bell. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. The big news, not making bongs right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the week's digital team this week are Jamie Timson, Felicity Capon and Arion McNicoll. And starting the show this week, it's Jamie. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Here's why it's gone topsy-turvy in the land down under.
For a third day, debate was dominated by Barnaby Joyce's citizenship.
On Tuesday, the Deputy Prime Minister admitted he had been a citizen of a foreign power right up until the weekend. In
a fortnight, the High Court will hear Barnaby Joyce's bid to stay in the capital after he found out he's a Kiwi.
Phoebe Bowden there reporting this week for 10 Eyewitness News in Australia. Jamie, tell us about this story because it really is quite bizarre.
So, Barnaby Joyce, who's the Australian Deputy Prime Minister, he's found out he's a Kiwi. Not the fruit, but a New Zealander.
Yes.
And
even though he was born in Australia.
Yes, it's his father, who's a Kiwi. He thought, well, he was surprised to learn that he was a New Zealander because you have to kind of opt out of being a New Zealand citizen. So if your father is a Kiwi, then you yourself are a Kiwi by definition.
Some achieve New Zealand citizenship, others have it thrust upon them. Okay, so he's an unwitting Kiwi.
Yes.
And this is news why?
This has it's a big news. So it's a single seat majority in the House of Representatives, and Barnaby Joyce cannot be a New Zealand citizen and be an elected individual. So there is a strong running thought that the New Zealand Labour Party have colluded with the Australian Labour Party, who are the official opposition in Australia, to attempt to bring down the government by bringing it to the world's attention that Barnaby Joyce is a Kiwi and therefore shouldn't have been elected, in the hope that this will then bring down the Australian government. It's subterfuge. It's got all of the
hold on.
rivalry.
Is there really a serious suggestion
that
New Zealand is operating sleeper cells in the Australian Parliament?
Yeah.
To take over by stealth over the course of a century?
Well, this
is our resident Australian speaking here. I assume you are, Arion. Are you actually a secret Kiwi?
Gosh, I should check that out immediately.
You're not allowed to be part of the podcast. Is that
a rule?
Kiwi nationals here.
So the suggestion is that the two Labour parties, the New Zealand Labour Party and the Australian Labour Party, had somehow colluded together. I mean, it's pretty bonkers. This is what the coalition government, who are the Conservative equivalent, that's what they're saying. They're saying that the Australian Labour Party got together with the New Zealand Labour Party and they made this happen.
And it's true in the sense that one of the senators in the New Zealand Parliament, Chris Hipkins, he did ask a very odd question 2 weeks ago, where he said, would a child in Australia to a New Zealand father automatically have New Zealand citizenship? Apropos of nothing, he asked this question just to ascertain the answer.
Exactly. And the new leader of the New Zealand Labour Party, Jacinda Ardern, has had to kind of step away from this question that got asked. So there is something to it in a funny way. It does look like that question was asked for no particularly good reason.
And Felicity, does it matter, actually, what country you're born in if you choose to represent and are elected to represent the country that you live in?
I just don't see that it does, really. I think, if anything, it probably makes you a stronger nation, and as to have people from various different backgrounds, it's more diverse. I think it probably strengthens the government. I can't see why it's such a massive deal. But I mean, if you look at other countries, if you think about the US, you actually have to be born in the US to become president, don't you? Which was the whole big thing, with Obama. But actually, like so many of these nations are nations built by immigrants. Trump's mum's Scottish, he's got German heritage. I can't possibly see how we need such purity in our...
On the other hand, you do need your elected officials not to be breaking the law. I agree with the point. I think that you should be able to be an MP in Australia regardless, or a senator, regardless of where you're from. But if the law says you can't, then you probably shouldn't.
But my other question is, did they not realise that did they not know?
They didn't
That's
know.
what to me is more staggering.
We all be secret Kiwis and not know.
Yeah, he didn't know. And the scandal started when the two co-leaders of the Greens had to resign because they found out that one woman found out she was Canadian and it brought her to tears on television because obviously, I mean, she lost her job, so that's why she was crying, to be fair to her.
She wasn't just totally devastated to be Canadian.
So basically because the law seems to suggest, or, different countries have different laws around citizenship. Well, so in Australia, you have to actively renounce your previous citizenship, but people don't realise that they are citizens of Canada or New Zealand, or Italy was one that was brought up as well, despite this guy saying, I've never been to Italy before. I don't know
there's a lot
any
of Italian immigrants in Australia.
Yeah. So 25% of people in Australia have been born outside of the country. That's
the highest in the world, isn't it, apart from Saudi Arabia, I think?
Yeah, for comparison, UK is only 13%.
But then presumably you're not going to be left with very many politicians who actually fulfil the criteria. If so many are now dropping out like flies, doesn't that suggest that you need politicians because you're not really going to have a big enough pool to choose from?
But I think that one of the particular issues with Barnaby Joyce is that he had to, before becoming an MP, sign documents saying, I am definitely not a citizen of another country. So it's either stupidity or there's either it was willful or he was actively lying.
But I mean, come on, grow up. Does it matter? I mean, it really doesn't matter, does it?
Probably
to
shouldn't.
The rest of the world, this is obviously ridiculous, isn't it? Well, unless as our resident Antipodean of uncertain origin, you can say for certain that there is something that the Aussies know about the Kiwis. There is something that we don't understand that those two know. Because it's not like there's a religious divide. They're both British colonies.
Oh, yeah, no, I don't
What's
think
the beef? Is there anything we don't get?
Probably just that New Zealanders are ever so slightly better than us and that we're a bit sort of reluctant to admit that most of the time, which is why any good New Zealander ultimately gets sort of swept up in a sort of quasi-Australian claiming.
But other than it being illegal, what is the actual problem in like Australians' minds?
So
why?
The idea,
why
so it was started in 1901. This part of the Constitution was written, and the idea behind it was that you didn't want someone in power who was working for or had another country's interests at heart.
Now that you say it, and I don't actually know if this is true, but I wonder whether it was a reaction to its colonial past, and actually what they were trying to do was make sure that people were Australian-born and Australian citizens rather than British imports, so that you had representatives who were definitely acting on behalf of the country in question rather than some foreign power.
So that's reasonable now, 100 years later, isn't it, to amend that to say, I don't know what. I mean, you need to be born in the Southern Hemisphere.
It's reasonable to amend it full stop. I'm not trying to argue for keeping that law that you have to be from Australia to be an MP.
Yeah, I guess, or you could just say that, you immediately renounce your other citizenships when you run for Parliament. Like, just have that as like a blanket thing. Like, if you want to go.
If you think that that's a problem, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a problem either. It's just like
actually,
it's the same thing
from that point of view, I don't know if there are, for example, Irish citizens who represent Britain in the House of Commons at the moment. I don't know. Are we allowed to do that?
You have to be. You can be a citizen of the Commonwealth and stand for and to be an MP.
Can you? Okay.
Yeah, but you can't be a dual citizen. It's the same law
so
here.
You do renounce your citizenship and become British. At the point you get your seat.
Yeah, but you can be a citizen of a Commonwealth country and stand and not have to renounce your citizenship of the Commonwealth country. But you can't be a dual citizen with Brazil.
Right.
You have to renounce your Brazilian citizenship.
You could be born in Brazil, renounce your Brazilian citizenship, and then become Prime Minister of the UK, which you couldn't.
It's not like America. Yeah.
And presumably you'd still have some loyalties to Brazil. That doesn't get around the whole.
You'd imagine so, yeah. And also, lots and lots of MPs and stuff take foreign money all the time. Take foreign donations, are in the pocket of Saudi Arabia. Lots of the government are in. No, allegedly. No, that doesn't rule out your attachment to foreign powers. Like, I always think that you want the best person in the best job. And so if that best person for running the country is foreign, then so be it. It's
arguably the most high-profile foreign MP in Britain is Gisela Stewart, isn't it? Who is pro-Brexit despite being German. So I don't know if that works really, unless the whole thing's just a double bluff. Okay, Felicity, what do you think this week's going to be remembered for?
Civil war rumbles on at Harvard.
47% of the women in my graduating class who interacted with single-sex social organizations reported by the time that they graduated they'd been sexually assaulted. Do you think that indicates a specific and localized crisis?
Well, I think it indicates that there's a real problem at Harvard, and it's a responsibility of the president of Harvard University and the administration to go in and investigate it, and if it's occurring and they can show that, get rid of those fraternities on campus that are engaged in it.
That was former Vice President Joe Biden talking to Mike's Antonia Hilton in 2016. And Felicity, Harvard have indeed been moving to close their last 7 fraternities. What's happened this week?
So this week, Vanity Fair published a really fascinating long read on the civil war at Harvard University, which is rumbling on between the president and the last 7 all-male final clubs at Harvard, which are pretty controversial. They only allow men in, and not just any old men. You have to sort of be punched for membership. You have to be a certain someone with a certain name. And it all seems to now sort of be coming to a head. The latest plan presented in July would ban outright the participation by Harvard students in final clubs, fraternities, sororities, or any other similar private exclusionary organisation.
And that word private is sort of the imperative word here, isn't it? I mean, why does it fall under Harvard's remit to regulate what someone does in their own private time on private property as part of a private club, so long as they're not breaking the law?
Well, quite, and I think this is part of the argument that the author of this article makes. I think it's, this isn't something that Harvard students themselves seem to have a massive problem with, and they haven't really decided on it or taken a vote or anything like that. But also it's interesting that a lot of these clubs, they don't ask for any money or funding or anything really from Harvard. They fund themselves, they have their own buildings, and I think in one case there was a student bursaries being paid out to one member of club to actually get him through Harvard. So they're not quite as bad as I think the popular media would have them be represented.
And essentially, I mean, that's true, isn't it? That depiction of them being bad has come about because they seem to represent values that are out of step with sort of modern contemporary thinking about what should happen when you go to university. Everyone should be embraced regardless of their background and evaluated on their intelligence and what they get up to, not what family they're from and how much money they have. But just because, in reality, there are these clubs that are selecting and they are male only, that doesn't necessarily mean they are bad. There's no proven link between those clubs and the things that everyone wants to stamp down on, like sexual abuse at university. It's all speculative.
Yeah, there may not be an easily discernible link. And I do think it's an interesting article and well worth reading. But it's funny that my feeling reading it was that the writer goes to such great pains to forgive all sorts of, they say, relatively low-level bads, like males only. And yes, it has a tendency to attract white males. And yes, many of them are rich and they have surnames. And yes, they engage in activities, at one point he's saying, where they're trading banter with one another that gets really quite dark by the sounds of things. It's all of this sort of trying to outdo one another in terms of their sexual depravity. And the writer is trying to make this case that, like, they should just be allowed to do their own thing. And perhaps there is an argument to it, but it just seems like, for me at least, he's explaining away all of the different problems that exist in these clubs and the reason why they are objectionable, so as to make the case that they should be just allowed to carry on. But they are perhaps a negative influence on society, aren't they? That's what's the problem with them, and that's why Harvard wants to do something about it.
I don't think you'd find many people that would argue that they aren't kind of have a negative influence. I think the question is whether you ban them or not.
The problem with banning them is that they now have to ban all the women's only clubs or African American or any club that discriminates in any way, which is
what you want to do is educate people enough to not join them. Like, what you want to do is have a situation where your child goes to university, sees what these clubs are about and sees the kind of issues that they do and says, actually, hang on a minute, I don't agree with this. I'm not going to join in on this. And then eventually they'll die out because they don't have enough people. But what you don't do is top down ban them.
But the problem with that is that when you know that, I think something like 18 US presidents were part of, they are bastions of male power and privilege and prestige. Like JF Kennedy was a member of the SPE at Harvard. I think it's a bit maybe idealistic to think that these people are going to say, no, I don't want to be part of this club, because actually, why would you not want to be part of these clubs?
Not the first person to call me idealistic.
You're someone who's chosen to go to an Ivy League university as well. So you've campaigned to get into a university that will give you advantages. You haven't just chosen the one, perhaps, that's best academically.
Yeah. Harvard itself is an exclusionary organisation.
Yeah.
But the writer John Sedgwick goes to such great pains to say about himself, that he was, what's the term, punched to join, and chose not to because he was, wanting to be a member of much more right-on organisations back in the day, and so he didn't need that club to get wherever he is today, But I just sort of think that yes, you do have this choice. Ban them outright is problematic because it does raise the question of where you stop banning clubs, and he wanted to equate that with McCarthyism, curiously. I mean, he just went for it, went totally nuclear. But what is the alternative if, as you say, Felicity, that people are still going to join these clubs if they exist?
I think it's arguments about no platforming, which has been a big deal at universities in this country. You let them exist, you expose them, but you also ridicule them and you give them enough rope to hang themselves to take them down. But I find it so sad at such liberal universities that actually the brightest minds in the world, we can't possibly deal with these clubs, they're just so horrendous, they just need to go. And actually, I think we need to expose them and sort of take the mickey out of them.
Well, Sedgwick actually sort of takes a dig, doesn't he, at that kind of university idea of liberal diversity in the article by saying that we're getting towards a world where, quote, everyone looks different but thinks the same. In other words, of course, everyone should come from all over the world and be all different colours, but ultimately, none of them should have extreme opinions.
But that's an argument for not going to Harvard. That's an argument for saying that not everyone needs to go to university and not everyone needs to go to these kind of liberal bastions. Yes, there needs to be a subsection of society that goes off and does those kinds of really great academic stuff and everything, but not everyone needs to go to Harvard, not everyone needs to go, and that's how you end up thinking differently, is by sending people to completely different places.
There's also, isn't there, the opportunity to reform from within. A lot of gentlemen's clubs, I mean, they don't have the same nefarious influence that some of these fraternities are said to have, but a lot of gentlemen's clubs in London have now become clubs where women can join as well. And that's because the men who are members of the club looked at themselves and said, it's the 21st century, let's change.
And there are some, like the Garrick, that voted on the issue and decided not to.
Yeah. Isn't that no different to the Women's Institute, really? They're saying, we want to be a men's-only club. If you join us, we're a men's-only club. That's the deal.
With the Women's Institute and organisations like that, are they not minority groups that have had to put up with white entitled males running the roost for so many centuries that they need to have their safe spaces where they can talk and form groups? But
as a white man, I don't really feel the need to have a safe space.
You may not.
I think with those gentlemen's clubs in London, I just think, how threatened are you that you have to retreat to this space where you can't even have women at the next table? What's the problem?
But you're picking the one example that you can think of where the membership have said they want to remain a gentlemen's club. But if that membership wants that, I don't see what harm that's causing everyone else. Well, in most cases, they've said, let's have women in.
If our argument is that we should wait for the elitist organisation to reform itself from within.
But there is young blood coming in all the time.
But there's no incentive to do that. But I mean, you'd have thought that it would have happened in the 60s if it was going to happen. Why has it not? I don't think our generation will be remembered as a particularly liberal one necessarily. And I suspect that there's yet more conservatism around the corner. Actually, there's chaos around the corner from the looks of things. But to expect a club to go out of its way to mandate against itself is perhaps absurd.
But the reality is that inside these fraternities, I'm sure behaviour isn't quite what it was 20 years ago. I'm sure there is an understanding that things don't have to be that way because there's a new generation of students.
Not from the sounds of things, from what Sedgwick says. There's all manner of bad stuff still going on in there. And a lot of it we don't even see because the membership isn't even public.
Yeah, I mean, I went to, when I did a trip around America, I went to Mississippi State University, and talking to people who were in fraternities there, they rule everything. Absolutely everything. And the way that the kind of hierarchy of it is set up, it's unavoidable that if you're a girl, you want to be in a sorority and you want to go to a frat house party because that's what everyone wants to do. And if you're a boy, you want to be in that frat house and be in that kind of thing. And yeah, I thought maybe it was a cliche, but when I was there, it was certainly not. People were living out these cliches.
Okay, and just to return to the subject of the clip that we played, actually, which wasn't about fraternities, but was about women being assaulted by the time they'd left Harvard. How do you change the culture in universities to get a situation where there isn't so much non-consensual sex happening? That seems like a bigger problem to me.
I think you have to start with the culture more widely. You have to not let someone who's admitted to sexually assaulting women become president. You have to have a much more wider top-down view of it than say these people aren't growing up, and it might be a bubble, but they're not growing up in a we're ever more connected than before.
When the first day when you turn up for university, you're young, you're impressionable. I think you think you're more grown up than perhaps you are. If there was more things like pamphlets explaining what consent means, explaining what an STD is, these sort of things. Universities are supposed to be where you're educated on not just your academic studies, but when you're trying to become an adult yourself, maybe there should be more discussion on campus about consent.
Let's move on. Arion, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
I think it'll be remembered for a massive "I told you so" from Al Gore.
There have been two huge changes in the previous decade. First, the climate-related extreme weather events have become far more frequent and more destructive, unfortunately. And that's been waking a lot more people up to this. But the second big change is that the solutions are here now. The cost of electricity from the sun and the wind has come down so dramatically and continues to come down. Many regions are now switching over completely to renewable energy. Many cities have already. And that's a really positive development. We need the political will to move faster, but political will is also a renewable resource.
Another former vice president there. You wait weeks for one of them to come along and then two come along at once. Al Gore talking about his new film, an inconvenient sequel, Truth to Power. And that interview was with our very own Arion McNicoll. You can see the interview and you can see what Arion looks like now at theweek.co.uk. Well, I mean, what's the point of listening? Everyone's just put their phones down and gone straight to the internet. But Arion, why have you chosen this as your moment of the week? Because, I'll be honest, I've barely switched on my telly or radio this week and not heard Al Gore. It seems to be a big story, but what are we missing?
I think it is a big story that he's back with a sequel. I think it's interesting that in spite of the fact that it's been reviewing so well, it hasn't yet taken off in the organic way that the original film did. There was so much talk about that film at the time, and I think it was because he was so very persuasive, maybe in a new way that we hadn't seen before at the time 10 years ago. Now that the sequel's out, I think maybe we've heard it all before, and it's quite hard to motivate people to feel as concerned and, agitated to do something about it as it was previously. So I think that the reason why it's back on the agenda, at least, well, the reason he's back talking about it is that I think he feels as though there needs to be a new impetus put into the environmental campaign. But I also think that despite the fact that the film was well received, it still has flown comparatively under the radar.
Okay, so it's getting a lot of hype and publicity, but perhaps the thing that we're missing in talking about that is that it needs a lot of hype and publicity because the public are going to take a little bit more work to get them interested in climate change now.
I think so. And I think that his view is that we really need to continue to show people the way in which climate change is genuinely having an impact on the world. And it's really the thrust of the film itself, and we're seeing, I should say, that what he's showing, the last time round, it was a lot of projections and computer-generated images of what may happen. And this time he's kind of drawing together the extreme weather events that have occurred in the last 10 years and showing how they really do indicate that environmental change is having a big impact on the planet. So, yes, so I think his view is we need to keep working on this. And my question is, can advocacy like this actually make the change that he thinks it can?
Great, let's tackle that. Felicity, can advocacy like this actually make the change that he thinks it can?
I very much hope so. I think it's fascinating with climate change that it's so slow moving. It's this biggest threat probably facing our planet, and yet it's happening at such a slow rate that people, I think it's Naomi Klein who talks about this in This Changes Everything, but the psychology is fascinating. We don't perceive it, or maybe we're just burying our heads in the sand, but whereas a terrorist attack, it happens like that. You're so likely to be involved in it, but people are absolutely terrified and do all sorts of crazy things because they're so scared of terrorism or wars. But climate change is just this very slow, insidious thing that's coming for us and that we don't want to engage with.
I think that I was listening to Adam Curtis talk to Russell Brand on Russell Brand's podcast, and he was talking specifically about this, and he was saying that actually if you were trying to advocate for doing something about climate change, what they should have done was rather than go for full nuclear and just say, actually you need to do this now because the world's going to end. Actually, sorry, it was too late. It's too late now. You should have done that 10 years ago. they should have done was really made specific things and said, look, this thing will change for you in the next 5 years. You know, you're not going to be able to do the thing that you thought you were going to be able to do before. Your children, it needed to be far more personalised. And actually what, you know, they've done wrong is by saying this the reason that he gives for it is that baby boomers started to get older. They realised they were dying. They were quite selfish and thought, well, what we're going to say is that everyone is going to die because we can't deal with the fact that we ourselves are dying. So we're just going to be like, well, it doesn't matter that we're getting old and dying because you're all dying with me. And you know, it's an interesting point.
That's
but
bleak.
Yeah, but I think that certainly if you think about your own actions as a person about trying to deal with climate change, it seems so minuscule, doesn't it? Like it's like such a huge, all-encompassing thing that you think, how is me separating my recycling going to stop the polar
but
ice
that's
caps
interesting because actually I think there was some research recently that said the two biggest things you can do to combat your climate footprint is not to have children, and secondly, not to travel on aeroplanes so much. Now, the likelihood of
recycling.
you can chuck your cans in the green box and feel good about that. But actually, if you seriously wanted to limit your carbon footprint, don't have babies, which is a really tough sell, which is no wonder the climate change groups aren't going around saying that. And B, don't go and have a holiday in, you know, Sri Lanka or whatever. And again, another really tough sell. So
and don't drive and don't eat meat.
Yeah. So what do you?
It's sort of everyone's favourite things, basically, isn't it?
But why don't we want? I mean, it's just really bizarre that we don't want to help ourselves out in the long run.
And I think maybe that's the problem, that individual desires are being set against global outcomes. Maybe this is your point, Jamie, that if we could see the way that our individual choices would individually benefit us, then we'd have a better case to make, or it would be a better way of making the case, rather.
Or just a way of just showing how people's lives, and that's what I think he's trying to do, Al Gore's trying to do at least, is to point out that this kind of crazy weather that we have is a direct result of, it's like, oh, it's getting a bit hot, and and everyone always laughs and says, oh, I think it's great in Britain because it just means we get warmer summers and that's fine. But actually, the flooding, all of these problems are a direct result of climate change.
But it is true, isn't it, that we do get warmer summers? I mean, actually, in all seriousness, we do get flooding in York, and that's awful, and we do see stories at Christmas time where people's houses freeze up, but actually, it is nicer in the summer. I mean, it does make it hard to sell here.
Yeah. I mean, the other reason that I wanted to bring this is because I think there is a question about whether advocacy and trying to change people's minds is actually going to be the thing that changes the conversation. One of the things that Gore says is that now, 10 years later, what we have is technology that has improved to a point where renewables are a genuine economic alternative in a way that they weren't 10 years ago. So it may turn out that the argument is one economically rather than being one morally or scientifically. And I think that it's funny to think that maybe for all of his films, I don't know how many sequels he plans to make, it may end up doing little compared with just solar and wind energy becoming a better choice for companies.
And what about the movie? Was it any good? Is it worth seeing?
It is good. It is worth seeing. I think for me it didn't have the same emotional impact as the original one, but it still has a pretty big punch. And so, yeah, I'd say definitely see it.
Are you going to see it, Felicity?
Absolutely.
I can't wait to see how the third one ends.
Well, that's enough hot air from us. That is it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Jamie Timson, Felicity, Capon and Arion McNicoll. For more from us at The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk, where you can also sign up to our free email newsletter, The Weekday, and of course you can get the magazine direct to your door as well. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. Remember, every past episode of this show is also available on our podcast feed. All you need to do is search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.